Benvenuti a tutti gli amici e gli studenti e i colleghi dell'Università di Foggia che seguono queste puntate di seminario online. Quindi passerei subito a presentare il nostro ospite di oggi. Lo faccio brevemente in inglese giusto per introdurre la lingua ufficiale poi della lezione del seminario di oggi, che sarà appunto l'inglese. I wish to thank Clifford Stevenson, that is a professor of psychology of the Nottingham Trent University in UK, and today will offer us a brief lecture on psychological emergency management and resilience. It's a field of study and research that we have not developed yet in our university. We work a lot, as every one of you knows, on educational psychology, school psychology, which are the main interest of our department. But emergency psychology is more and more relevant to every one of us for the crisis we're living now of the Ukrainian refugees. But not only about that, also the life-changing event of the pandemic has had an important impact in terms of rethinking our psychological intervention within the framework of the emergency psychology. And I think now it's the time to start to open up an interest, at least, not a field of study, but starting to open up an interest, an academic interest on this specific psychological domain. And today is the very first seminar we have on this subject. So I want to thank again Clifford, who will be so gentle to introduce himself to the public and then start the presentation. Giusy Toto, that has organized this meeting, unfortunately, she couldn't connect because she had an emergency in the department she had to solve. She will join us hopefully at the end of the event, coordinating the session of the question session. So thank you very much, Clifford. It's the floor is yours. And as I mentioned before the opening of the lecture, we wish to host you here in the south of Italy, in our university, as soon as you can, and offer maybe a longer, intensive seminar to our PhD student that I'm sure will be extremely interested by the short presentation of today. So thank you, Clifford.
Thank you very much, Professor Limone. That's a lovely introduction. And so thank you for the invitation to speak to your group. I'll just attempt to share my screen now. And so can people see that? Yeah. Can people see the presentation?
Oh, no, unfortunately not yet. Not yet. Okay.
Is that showing now?
Not yet, unfortunately.
Okay,
yeah.
How about now?
Yeah, now it's working. Now it's working.
Great, excellent. So, as I say, thank you very much for the invitation. And today I will be talking about the psychology of collective response to emergencies. So, starting off with the current, I guess, state of the field in relation to the social psychology of collective responses to emergencies and disasters, and focusing particularly on the social identity model of collective resilience. I'll then be talking a little bit about more recent research that our group at Nottingham Trent University have undertaken on community identity, so the identities of neighbourhoods, local communities, and how they can be understood as providing longer-term resilience and preparedness for emergencies and disasters, and illustrating that with a couple of examples of research concerning the current pandemic. So Why emergencies and disasters? Of course, Professor Limoni has been illustrating the increased relevance of this, the increased importance of this, and the role that universities are going to have to play in supporting local and national responses to emergencies and disasters. We live in unprecedented times for the occurrence of global challenges requiring local emergency responses. So in terms of climate change, in terms of extreme weather events and the food insecurity that goes along with that, in terms of war and terrorism, in terms of both climate change and war leading to population displacement, as Professor Limoni has been mentioning, and of course, recently pandemics as well. So it does feel like the four horsemen of the apocalypse. A beautiful picture there by one of your contemporary artists. It's gotten to the stage that in terms of European Union policy, every city, town and rural authority needs emergency planning in place. This is being implemented across Ireland at the minute. I know that it's a requirement for European countries going forward. And those plans need an evidence base. One of the core messages from the research in this area so far is that any emergency planning will need to engage the local population in collective responses. Okay, and that is the case because no emergency service can deal with the challenges on this scale. Local communities will need to be engaged, need to be prepared, need to mobilize their collective resources to deal with these challenges of extreme weather events, terrorist events, population displacement and pandemics. And so what we need is an understanding of how communities react during disasters and how community resilience can be fostered and developed over time to cope more effectively with these challenges. So I start with the psychology of how people respond during disasters. And this work has been led by Professor John Drury at the University of Sussex over the past number of decades. And his work as a starting point takes the Le Bonian myth of panic in the face of emergency. So Gustave Le Bon, the social commentator in the late 19th, early 20th century, talking about the crowd as inherently irrational, as inherently panicked in the face of emergencies. And that myth suggests that instinct overwhelms socialization in the case of emergency. Emotions for people caught up in emergencies outweighs their reasons. Rumors and sentiments spread uncritically through the crowd through the imagined contagion of emotion. And people react disproportionately and selfishly to the challenges that they face. That's the myth. And that myth is unfortunately embedded in many government documents and many guidance that governs responses to emergencies. And it can lead to emergency services mistreating crowds, suspecting them of behaving in an irrational and selfish way. It can lead to the blaming of victims and the withholding of support during emergencies. And it can undermine a crucial response of the crowd's effort to help itself in such disasters. So if we contrast that to the evidence of what actually happens during disasters, well, one clear example is what happened on the July 2005 London bombings, so the 7th of July bombings. This was an example of 4 bombs going off in the center of London, 3 of them in the underground, that led to 52 deaths and over 700 casualties. The emergency services weren't able to reach all the survivors immediately, especially those underground. So the people affected had to help themselves. And that's typical for emergency situations of this kind. Drury and his colleagues have looked at the contemporary newspaper accounts, personal accounts, interviewed those involved, and coded the data. And what they have found was that the accounts of people involved in those events were overwhelmingly of helping and being helped by others. So in terms of the newspaper accounts, largely people seeing others being helped and helping themselves. The personal accounts the same, the interviews with survivors the same. Selfish behaviors constitute a tiny proportion of the overall the overall experiences of events of this kind. One might suspect that there was something unique about the London bombings as a terrorist event, perhaps, that the people would respond effectively as a group. But actually, jury's work looking across a range of different disaster events, so from sinking ships to bombs, to hotel fires, to train accidents, to evacuations, to stadium crushes, finds a similar pattern. So interviewing participants from across these events, what they find is several core themes. Firstly, that there is no panic by and large. So someone from the 7th of July bombing saying there was no panic, just an overwhelming sense to get out of the station quickly. Secondly, there is an absence of selfish behavior. No shoving, pushing, or anything. Everyone is trying to help one another in these situations. There is increased altruism. People keeping calm and trying to help one another to see if anyone was injured in the 7th of July bombings again. And crucially, there is an increased sense of a shared identity, a bond with other people caught up in those disasters. So someone from a ship disaster saying there was a sort of camaraderie, like you hear about in a war situation. There's a pulling together as opposed to a pulling apart. And Drury and his colleagues have developed from this the social identity model of collective resilience, SIMCAR. That argues that in such emergencies, what happens is that the common situation, the common experience that are faced by people involved leads to a perception of common fate. People are in the situation together. And from this emerges a shared sense of social identity, so a shared bond with other people involved in the situation. And from that, we expect to help others, and we expect others to help us. And the consequences of that is that within a situation, the shared sense of identity allows coordination of activity between people and enhances their sense of being able to cope and being able to deal with the disaster, the challenge that they face. Okay? There's quite a substantial body of evidence that attests to the validity of this model. So, for example, John Drury and his colleagues have developed virtual reality simulations of disasters occurring within train stations and within nightclubs, and are able to manipulate the different factors, always finding that a sense of common fate leads to this emergent sense of shared identity, which predicts how people behave. There's a good deal of qualitative evidence, talking to people involved in various emergencies and disasters, such as floods and bombs, finding that similarly, a strong sense of shared identity is reported by people at these events, leading to transformations in their behavior towards other people. And a good deal of survey evidence being able to statistically model these particular effects, typically retrospective surveys, finding that a sense of shared identity predicts the giving and receiving of help and the actual undertaking of helping behavior in a coordinated way. So on the basis of this evidence, Drury and colleagues are making recommendations to those responsible for providing care and support during emergencies, saying that in the response phase, once the disaster has occurred, really what we should be doing is attempting to mobilize the crowd, attempting to engage those involved in the emergency and caught up in the emergency to help themselves. So the role of the security services and the emergency services should be to communicate effectively with the general population, to accommodate their ability to help. And this is particularly important in those emergencies where the first responders, the emergency services, take time to actually reach the scene of the emergency. We have to rely on the public to help themselves. Drury emphasizes building a shared identity between the services and the public, so building trust, which will facilitate communication and coordination, and working with the group leaders on the ground. And this is important in the recovery phase over the longer period of time to maintain communication with recovering communities, to enable them to sustain their recovery from disasters. and to mobilize wider social solidarity, to link the communities affected into the broader population. But what I would argue for the purpose of this talk is that there's less detail in Drury's model on how we can prepare in the longer term for the future occurrence of emergencies. A lot of this is reactive. A lot of this is what to do when an emergency can occur. But actually, when it comes to the detail of how we prepare communities for disasters and emergencies in the future, there's less from this model by way of advice. And so what I want to do is to think a little bit about how we might capture existing community processes, existing community psychology to enable resilience to disasters in the longer term. So the part 2 of the talk is focusing in on this. Now, we know from the broader literature on disasters and resilience that community cohesion, or what sociologists might call social capital, is linked to disaster resilience and recovery. Those communities that are more cohesive, those communities that have got better bonds of trust and reciprocity between their members, actually deal better with disasters and recover better from disasters afterwards. And that's because they contain already a number of resources that can be used during the disasters. They've got better social infrastructure in terms of existing groups and regular meetings. They've got better communication infrastructure between local residents in terms of social media and communication technology. They also have a resource of volunteering in communities with high degrees of social capital. So there's already human resource that can be mobilized in times of disaster. And this established infrastructure and norms of engagement enables local communities to deal with disasters and respond more effectively. So what about the psychology of this? Well, our group at Nottingham, Trent and colleagues around the world, especially in University of Queensland and in Australia, have been looking at, well, what is it about the psychology of neighborhood dynamics that enables neighborhoods to respond in this way? What provides the sense of cohesion and social capital? And what we're finding is that it is neighborhood identification, the degree to which a resident identifies with other people within their neighborhood, that psychologically unlocks a lot of these resources. So those who identify highly with their community are more trusting, helping, and engage in reciprocal interactions with their neighbors. Neighborhood also provides a sense of continuity and belonging, which satisfies basic psychological needs. And neighborhoods are also a site of rights and entitlement to local services and resources. So neighborhoods are good for us. They actually have an impact upon our health and well-being insofar as people identify, and they can provide resilience to a variety of threats, including economic deprivation and adversity, to gentrification, and to residential diversification. And this is something that your group is going to be particularly interested in. If you're concerned with helping communities support an influx of refugees, then our research has been showing that strong neighborhood identification prepares people psychologically to engage with an influx of incomers. So strong neighborhood identification leads to better integration of new populations. But for present purposes, we're thinking about, can these resources enable people to deal with disasters? And I'm going to report 2 cases from the UK. You'll be 2 studies from the UK. You'll be aware that the United Kingdom fared particularly poorly, especially in the first wave of COVID, where we had over 290,000 cases and almost 45,000 deaths. There was a lockdown introduced to combat this quite late in comparison to other countries, but the adherence to restrictions was high. It was quite effective. And what we noted was that really on the ground, community cooperation was essential for the well-being of isolated, vulnerable residents. Quite literally, isolated and vulnerable residents were relying on their neighbours for food and for support to get them through the crisis. So we know the group processes are in action here and are crucially important. But what are the psychological mechanisms underpinning this? Well, we conducted a first survey in June 2020 via Prolific Academic, looking at 205 adults from across the United Kingdom, and we measured various attributes, including their community identification, their personal well-being, their depression and anxiety, and their sense of unity during COVID-19, so the sense of unity with their neighbours during COVID-19. And we also looked at the degree to which they provided and received social support. So our first analysis here, we can see that community identification was indeed related to well-being, and as it happens, anxiety and depression. And this was mediated, so the process that this occurred through was an increased sense of unity with one's neighbours. So community identification, predicting well-being through a sense of unity with one's neighbours. And we also found that giving help, so giving help and coordinating your help with other people, was boosting people's sense of community identification. Okay, so we have evidence that this sense of community identification during the disaster was promoting well-being through a sense of common fate with neighbours. Okay, but this is cross-sectional, and it doesn't tell us much about the longitudinal effects of neighbourhood identification on community resilience. So I want to briefly talk about a second study, and this is a 3-wave study that we were conducting before COVID hit, so that one of the waves, the final wave, occurred as the pandemic was unfolding. So the first wave was 254 adults in November 2021, then 217 in February 2022, just as the pandemic was starting, and then 149 in May. So it's a rather valuable data set in that it's a longitudinal study of how people have reacted to the pandemic. We measured similar constructs, community identification, and this is community identification pre-pandemic, and perceived community support pre-pandemic, and then giving and receiving of support and adherence to lockdown rules during the pandemic. And we had a particular, one of our co-authors is Sebastiano Costa from the university in Naples, as it happens, a wonderful colleague who has very advanced statistical skills and did this beautiful model for us. So we're very grateful to Sebastiano for his input into the paper. This is a cross-lagged panel model of 3 stages, time 1, time 2, time 3, plotting the impact of community identification and community support on these different variables and on the outcome measures at time 3. So we're able to look at the relationship between these different measures and their impacts on the outcomes. And this is the actual statistical model. And so what we can see is that community identification is predicting community support over time. So this is the direction of influence. And community identification has its impacts on the giving and receiving of support during the pandemic and the perception of community support through the perception of community support at the second time point. So this is stronger evidence for the direction of the relationships and the influence of community identification over time on resilience and on responses to the pandemic. Okay, so that's a very, very brief overview of the research that we've been conducting recently. And so in relation to COVID-19, what we're arguing is that local community identity, neighborhood identity plays an important role in collective responses to the pandemic. And cross-sectionally, we can see that there's a relationship between community identity, helping, and well-being. But more importantly, longitudinally speaking, pre-existing community identity is predicting behavior during the pandemic through perceived social support. Okay, and why is this important? Well, you know, the social identity model of community or collective resilience can help security services and emergency services manage populations and manage those affected at the time of the emergency. But what our research is suggesting is that prior to the emergency and thinking forward to the future, if we pay attention to community dynamics and we can pay attention to the development of community resilience now, then we can affect the behavior of communities and the responses of neighborhoods to disasters in the future. So our predictive model should allow us to more accurately determine which communities will fare better under pressures, under adversity. So, for example, if you are deciding to which communities to send Ukrainian refugees, you can use this kind of modeling to determine which communities are going to thrive with an influx of refugees rather than experience conflict and rejection. Okay. Likewise, under COVID, you can see which communities are going to fare better in terms of self-sustaining behavior versus others. So it allows us to think a little bit about enhancing neighborhood identity and processes for the future directly through the provision of training and resources and event preparedness directly to communities, but indirectly through enriching community infrastructure and integrating local community services, and over time by helping communities develop a stronger sense of local place, history, and agency. So I'll leave it there, and I'll leave you with a picture of our baby son, who's just 9 months old. You may hear him in the background, he's sometimes a little bit vocal, and I'll ask for any questions.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Clifford. It was a very inspiring, extremely interesting presentation. The model you presented has a tremendous implication in terms of policy development for the crisis that we face more and more often, as you described. So I think it's something we need to focus on with more attention in the next future in terms of academic competence we could develop as a group. You mentioned a colleague of ours, Sebastiano Costa, that is from the same academic sector. He works in developmental and educational psychology at the University of Naples. And so I see there are contacts that could be developed more and more, and relations and academic networks that could be developed in order to collaborate with you more and more. So great. I think Josie is back here, but anyway, I will. I'm happy to be the medium for your questions. If someone offers me a text, or Martina, Marco, who is offering the questions to Clifford.
Yes, I have a question to ask.
You have a question. Okay, great.
Yes, Professor Clifford. First of all, thank you so much for your wonderful intervention and interesting intervention. I am Martina Rossi, a PhD student in neuroscience and education, and I'm so glad to meet you. So I have a question to ask you and a reflection to pose. As we know, the COVID-19 pandemic and recent political and historical events are to be considered a threat to psychological resilience, especially among younger people. All of this is due to a sense of insecurity and no perspective and expectation of the futures. So the new generation are conditioned by continuous situation of insecurity, anxiety, and fear for their future, for our future. So we are pushed to abandon our life project. So according to your experience in our small university context, which concrete strategies should we put in place to promote resilience?
Thank you very much, Martina. That's a very astute observation, and it's a very interesting question. It's a big challenge, really, facing all of us, particularly universities thinking about the challenges, especially facing the younger generation. I guess one of the key things that we find in our area of research is that the more isolated and individualized people are, especially young people, then the more vulnerable they are to anxiety, and the more vulnerable they are to the unpredictability of the circumstances they find themselves in. So that we find that isolation, and in particular loneliness, acts to exaggerate and amplify the effects of uncertainty on the lives of young people. So I would say that in terms of concrete strategies, social inclusion, proactive social inclusion, is probably the most effective way that we find of providing people with enhanced psychological resilience, with collective resilience. And so a concrete example, and I know that you're talking about young people from the perspective of careers and the many challenges that they face, but just in terms of students, we find that undergraduate students who are isolated and disengaged from their class and from the universities are the most psychologically vulnerable. And if we can find ways of linking them into the university community through recreational groups or through a stronger sense of class identity, so that they're actual class cohorts, we find that their resilience is better, that their mental health is better, and that their attainment and performance is better. So I think that the social inclusion and group memberships, I think, are the most effective way.
Okay, thank you so much for your answer.
Okay, thank you for the question, Martina. I think we are actually working in this dimension because we work as a university to develop the community belonging, the perception of belonging to a community. And for example, we have an event in the next few weeks that is a large hackathon that will involve hundreds of students all night long in order to design intervention models in the university that would generate a better perception of wellness. And this is a meta intervention that they work on wellness, but they generate wellness because they are together in a community event that will strengthen the links among them. So somehow I think we are on the right track. Marco, please, I understand that you want to ask a question as well.
Yeah, thank you. Good morning, Professor. First of all, thank you very much for your intervention. I found it very, very illuminating. So for my question, I will refer a little to my own recent experience. So sorry for being a little self-centered, maybe. So I have recently moved and now I live by myself. So I am 25 years old. And I think that this change, this crucial experience that we all have experienced, I think, or will experience, I feel like it is more and more difficult in this climate of emergency between pandemics and wars. And so my question is, what is, from a psychological point of view, an effective way for young people to face and manage this life experience within this context of this regular life experience within this particularly and extraordinary context of emergency? Thank you.
Thank you, Marco. That's a very good question indeed. And in fact, our group does quite a bit of research on residential mobility. And so that's the psychological challenges posed by relocating to a different place, a different environment. Relocation typically involves severing of your existing group ties and it's quite often an isolating experience. The large-scale studies have demonstrated that it can have a negative impact upon health and well-being. And in fact, indeed, some studies have demonstrated that it can have a negative impact on mortality in the longer term, okay, depending on how people react. It's a classic example of a major transition that has an impact upon one's social network. And really the main recommendation that would the social identity approach would suggest is to join groups, yeah, to forge connections in the destination location. I know that is very, very difficult in the current situation where physical interaction is limited, and that the majority of interactions often occur online, certainly during periods of lockdown. But it is crucially important that people are proactive at establishing new relationships. And not simply new relationships for the at an individual level, new group memberships. Yeah. So social relationships have a loneliness reducing quality, but group memberships have an additional benefit in terms of impacting upon health and well-being. And more than that, in addition, there is an additional health benefit to be had from volunteering. So not simply taking part in sports or recreational groups, but actually volunteering to help others. That's where you get the maximal effect. The reduction in loneliness, the access to group psychological resources, and then the benefits of volunteering. And so there are three things that you can do there to really maximize the psychological benefits of reconnecting with people socially. I hope that's useful.
Yeah, thank you. So I will work on that. Maybe not right now because I'm affected by COVID right now, but in future, I will surely do it. Thank you very much.
Okay, get well soon.
Yeah, but we are all able now to be social online as well, not just in presence. So you can use that as you are doing now, actually, attending these classes and chatting with us. So, Clifford, it was a pleasure and honor to host you today in this quick seminar session. And as mentioned many times, you're more than welcome to visit us here in Foggia. Actually, I hope Giusy will try to connect with you in the following weeks to arrange that as soon as you can. So thanks again, and thanks to all the students and to all the academic community that attended the seminar today or that will attend the class in the following days, since it will be stored online in our repository. So, Clifford, thank you.
Professor Ramani, thank you very much for the invitation, and lovely to meet you all. Okay, goodbye.
Bye.